I'm Steve Sider. I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Education at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. I'm a former teacher and school administrator and currently involved with special education and school leadership research across Canada. So intersectionality is the idea of connectedness. It's the ways in which a person's identity is formed and is shaped. It's more than just one aspect of a person. It's all these various pieces that make a person who they are. One of the things in my world of research is that we sometimes dig into or focus on a specific area. So my area of research focuses on students with special education needs and how school principals can support them in inclusive schools. The danger in that is that we are focusing on one aspect of that child, their area of exceptionality or diagnosed condition. And intersectionality helps us broaden the understanding to realize that a child is made up of all these complex aspects that, when they're layered together, form who that child is. So as an example, I often think of a student when I was a school principal who came into our school, had some oppositional behaviors, some issues that when, as a team, we kind of focused on the behavior because that was what we were seeing in the school and in the classroom. And so my focus became on that child's behavior. And it wasn't until a conversation with that child's father where I started to unpack all these different aspects of the child that we really didn't recognize early in that child's experience in the school. So issues around poverty, single family, issues around sexual orientation, aspects that were really important for developing an understanding of who that child was, but really had not been the focus because we were so focused on the behavior. And it's a natural thing that as teachers and as school principals, we focus on those things that are kind of most predominant in our experience with the child. Intersectionality helps us unpack that a little bit and say, what are the other aspects of that child that help us understand kind of all the aspects that contribute to equity in our schools. So to bring that to kind of a real example as a school principal, I often will say to principals, when you're having your school team meeting, you're focusing on a child, you've got 15 or 20 minutes, and you're going to kind of think about all those, that child's needs, is to take kind of a global and a local approach to the child, to think about, to stop by just pausing and thinking about what are the various aspects that we haven't been thinking about or haven't been talking extensively about with regard to this child. So think about the global, and what are those intersectional aspects to that child's identity. Then dive in and think specifically of the specific needs that child has. In my world, that is around special education. So what can we unpack that child needs? But then to go back to the global before we wrap up this meeting and say, okay, we've dug deep into the child's needs, but what are some of those things that we need to be mindful of that make that child a complex human being? And I think that's an important aspect of intersectionality, as well as this idea of also realizing that these various aspects of intersectionality also can unpack or unveil aspects of disadvantage or advantage, aspects where they have had privileges removed from them or where they are privileged, and to understand that those things can contribute to understanding of who that child is as well. So again, as school principals, we need to think about the idea of intersectionality because it helps us understand the full child and not just sometimes the specific aspects of that child that we might be focused on. So intersectionality is really important for principals and for the full school team because it helps us understand the full child. Recently we held a conference in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia on intersectionality, and one of our guest speakers was a gentleman named Kevin Lamoureux, who's the former education director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. One of the things that struck me about what Kevin said is that diversity is not a weakness, it's a strength. And that's really what intersectionality helps helps us understand is that diversity, the full community, the full child, really adds to the strength and diversity of a school. And for staff, that's really important, because for teaching staff and for support staff, seeing the complexity of children is a way for the staff to recognize that the school is a microsystem, it's an ecosystem, it's a place where diversity is something that's a beautiful thing. It can really provide a place for all children, all students to feel welcomed and included in the school environment. Another example that has been a really powerful way for me to understand intersectionality was another student that we supported in a school in which I worked. That student, before he came into our school, we had received some of the intake information and realized he had some complex needs, particularly around behavior. We had an interview with his mother. His father had died a few years earlier. And in that conversation, before the student even came into our school, we started to realize some of the complexities of who this young person was. And there were some things that came out of that meeting that would never have come out of a normal intake. And I won't go into the details of that, except to say that as a school team then, we were able to take that information, and then when that student came into our school, we were able to provide a really diverse level of support and really focus on relational aspects with him that really made that child's program and progress really successful. It's interesting because a number of years later, this is a few years ago, but a number of years later, I found out that student had completed high school, had completed university, had in fact completed his Bachelor of Education and was a teacher back in that very same school system. I'm not saying that's causational, but I am saying that experience with the staff, meeting with the mother, learning more about the complex needs of this child, and all those aspects that beyond his behavioral needs, but all those other aspects of what made that child who he is and who he was, really led to the supports he needed within that school. So one of the ways that we can provide supports for students and for staff around intersectionality is around a typical thing that we do in schools, which is around learner profiles and class profiles. And teachers are so accustomed to developing learner profiles that we often focus on kind of what I would consider a flat or a two-dimensional aspect of learner profile. So we develop a learner profile. The learner profile is focused on the individual education plan, perhaps reading levels, math scores, EQAO scores, and so forth. And it provides a great starting point for acknowledging the learning needs of that child. I would encourage staff, principals in their work with staff to think about a three-dimensional or 360-degree aspect of learner profiles, and to build into those learner profiles not only those learning areas or learning outcomes that we want to focus on, but also the other aspects that form who that child is. What do we know about their socioeconomic status? What do we know around issues around cultural and linguistic background? So as I think about an example of that, if I know from a socioeconomic perspective that there are various challenges that student might be experiencing, it should help frame and shape the full level of supports that we provide for that student. Are we recognizing that there are perhaps some economic limitations that would limit them from enrichment activities that might be really beneficial for that child, but that unless we acknowledge that aspect of intersectionality, we're maybe not going to be able to provide the full level of programming that student could benefit from? Can they access enrichment programs like DEC at the high school level, or FIRST Robotics or FIRST Lego at the elementary and secondary school level? When we acknowledge those things and recognize that those might be barriers, that those might be aspects that limit that child, but then put into place ways or avenues or pathways that can support them, it can really change the playing field. And again, it gets back to that idea of equity. How do we ensure that the outcomes for that child, not only as far as access, but as far as outcomes, are going to be equitable to other students? That is at the heart of what we do with intersectionality. So over the last number of years, I've led a number of national studies that have looked at school principals and supporting students with special education needs in inclusive schools. It's really fascinating what we've been discovering. That we're on our fourth nationally funded study in this area now, and there's a number of things that align very much with the Ontario Leadership Framework. We know that building relationships is critical for the conditions of success. We know that communication is critical for the conditions of success. We know that principals model the way. They lead the way by modeling, and that modeling can never be underemphasized. Modeling not just with students with special education needs, but with every student in the school environment. What does it mean to welcome every child? What does it mean to be hospitable to every child? What does it mean to incorporate and fully include every child, whether it's in a large high school of 2,000 students or a small rural elementary school of 150 students, whether that population of that school seems to be diverse or whether there's lots of aspects of diversity that maybe are not visible. What does it mean to welcome every child? So those three aspects have been not surprising. A number of aspects that have come up in our studies that really support the idea of setting the table, of providing a place where everyone feels welcome and where the conditions for success are equitable for all, that surprised us a little bit. And these were shared through principals' sharing of what we are calling critical incidents, or as a psychologist named Jack Mesereau who talks about disorienting dilemmas. Things that kind of prompted a principal or a school leader, a vice principal to think for themselves, why do I believe what I believe? What are my core values, and why are those values what they have developed into? And as they reflected on these critical incidents, moments that might not have been negative or might not have been these, really significant moments that other people would perceive as significant, but still were really meaningful. They often thought about hallway conversations, or they shared an incident in which there was a conversation in the staff room or with a parent or caregiver, which might have seemed innocuous. It might not have seemed like anything major to other people, but really either cemented or altered their perspective of what inclusive education is about. And two things that came out of those conversations that we found really interesting. One was the aspect of humility, and one was the aspect of reciprocity. And let me just talk about those for a moment. With regard to humility, what we found principals talking about was how much they learned through the experiences of welcoming varieties of students, diverse students into their schools. And again, this gets at that idea of intersectionality. When we see the full child, the whole child, all those various aspects of the child, it should cause us to stop and think to ourselves and to reflect upon, what is it that I need to learn about diversity and about inclusion? And I'd encourage everyone as they're watching these videos to just stop for a moment and to think about a child that they might have taught, or that might have been in one of the schools in which they led, or perhaps is in a school that you're in right now, and to think about a hypothetical child, a child that you have not yet met, but might reflect some of the things we're talking about, and just to ponder some questions around that child and to think about what can you learn from the experience of learning more about that child's life trajectory. What aspects of intersectionality would inform your understanding of that child, and that might help you understand what it means to work towards equity, towards social justice as a school principal. So I'd encourage you to stop and just think about some questions around what might we want to know about that child's background, what might be aspects of our own privilege that we need just to stop and say, okay, I need to put that on hold for a moment to understand what that child's trajectory can teach me, and not just that child, but perhaps their siblings, their family, their parents or caregivers, the grandparents with whom they live. What might we learn from that child's linguistic background? I think of a child that I worked with many years ago who came into our school and was incredibly able with regard to languages. He struggled in so many other aspects of learning, but languages was one of those things that came quickly to him, and he came as a bilingual student, French and English, learned Spanish, learned Japanese, learned Thai as a student, and it helped me understand, oh my goodness, all those things I was thinking about this child, those perceptions I had and perhaps stereotypes that I developed, I need to just step back and say, what some amazing attributes that child has. So keeping in mind that idea of humility and just what can we continue to learn. If you've been a principal for 20 years or for 2 years, what can we learn about the students and their families in our schools? And likewise, what can we learn about our staff as well that we sometimes maybe don't take the time to understand? The second thing that came out of those interviews with principals, 300 principals, was the idea of reciprocity. And again, it connects with the idea of humility, checking our own biases and our own perceptions. With reciprocity, the idea is how can the learning experiences I'm experiencing and the things that I'm doing as a leader work together to improve the school environment, to serve to develop the conditions or the criteria for success for all students. So a reciprocal attitude says, how can I learn and how can I share and how can we learn together? And again, that gets at the idea of community, of setting the table where everyone feels welcome. I will often say to people, I love food, and so setting the table is a great analogy for me or a great metaphor for me. So when you go back and you think about that student, and I've asked you to think about, as you think about that student in relation to the things we're talking about today, what does it mean to set the table for that student? If we were to sit down physically at a table and eat together, or metaphorically, what are the things that they can learn from me? What can I learn from them? And I think reciprocity, I want to say one other thing with regard to reciprocity, which is really important, and that has to do with reciprocity principals have with themselves. And that may seem like a bit of a strange concept, but one of the things that has been coming out of the work we've been doing with principals is this idea of mental health, mental wellness, recognizing that this is a topic that we have been aware of with regard to students and increasingly aware of with regard to teachers. And it's a topic I think we need to address as principals as well. And I think that's an aspect of reciprocity. Being humble about the learning that we're experiencing and also reciprocal in sharing. Maybe there's times when we struggle from our mental health perspective as well. The job of a principal is incredibly complex. It's becoming increasingly complex as we have divergent needs in our schools. What do we understand about our own mental health? When are we seeking support and help around that aspect? I think that's an aspect of equity as well. Equity is not just about setting the table for our students. It's also setting the table for teachers, for support staff, for the person who works in the office, for the person who's taking care of our school from a cleaning perspective. And it's also about us and checking our own mental health and our own needs as well. So I often talk to school principals about the 3 Ps that we need to be cognizant of. Those 3 Ps are positionality, perspective, and privilege. So as principals, those 3 Ps are really important, particularly again from an intersectionality perspective, because we need to recognize that we come with certain privileges as principals. We have had a certain education. That education has had a trajectory. We've gone through, in most cases, long teaching experiences. We've become vice principals or right into the principal role. We usually have an office or some sort of space that's privileged within the school. We might have a name tag or a badge on our doors that gives us a position within that school. And we have to remember, as a result of that privilege, that our perspective, one of the other Ps, sometimes might not be the perspective that everyone else in the school shares. That includes our teachers and support staff, family members, and certainly students. So sometimes I just want to encourage principals to think about those 3 Ps because they can inform things like our communication. So when we have a student that comes into our school with the privileges that we might have experienced, we might not be able to share the same stories as those students or those family members. So again, keeping a perspective that's humble, that's reciprocal, and saying, how can I learn from this person's experience, helps us with supporting students, supporting supporting their family members, supporting those people who care about them and who support them. So as an example, I think about students or family members who sometimes have gone through the process of a formal diagnosis. They've gone through the months of waiting to get the supports that are needed for that child. They've gone through a formal psychoeducational assessment, and then they get this document that says this child has this diagnosis or this exceptionality. And that can be a really traumatic experience for students. And as a principal, if I have not had that same journey, I might not understand the depths of that kind of emotional experience for the child. So again, as a principal, if we remember our privilege and we remember our perspective and we think about positionality, it helps us to say, okay, how do I walk with this family through this journey, through this experience? Because that can be a long, time-consuming process. It's not just something where we sit across the table or beside a parent or beside a caregiver and say, here's what we know, now what are we going to do about it? But that can be a long process, weeks and perhaps even months or even years. So as principals, it's important as part of our journey towards equity to realize that the experiences that family members and that students are going through are not necessarily experiences that we've had. So we need to check those perspectives that we've had, check our positionality, check that position that is on our office door and say, okay, let's just stop for a moment and ask ourselves some important questions and walk through this journey in a very humble and reciprocal way. Humility is such an important aspect of the characteristics or attributes of a principal. And if we go back to the Ontario Leadership Framework and we think about some of those personal leadership resources, I think they connect very, very well with the idea of humility. Humility is about being able to check our own perspectives, our own biases. It's being able to stop, to be able to pause, to say upon reflection, which is one of those wonderful statements that I think every principal and every teacher should incorporate on a regular basis. It's a matter of being able to say, help me understand. What can you share with me? This is a question we can ask of students, we can ask of our staff, we can ask of family members. Help me understand. And it's a question I ask on a regular basis because I know that there's my knowledge, my skills, the competencies I bring into my role as a school leader are limited. I might have had a lot of years of experience, but I'm still limited in knowing all aspects of what's happening in my school and of every person in my school. So a principal who's humble is prepared to step back and pause and ask, help me understand. And this can be a question, as I said, to students, to staff, to family members, and engaging in a conversation, not just stopping with the question, help me understand, but asking specific questions around, so tell me more about, or can you tell me about a time when, or how does this make you feel when? Those kinds of questions, which we might call kind of soft skills kinds of questions, or they lead to soft skills or soft kinds of answers, but they get at the idea of the humanity, the common connections that we have as a community. And again, coming to the table, trying to understand what everyone brings to the table and their various needs and their various skills and strengths that they can bring as well. We all know that relationships are critical to what we do as school principals and as educators generally. I was at a conference recently in June, and a former student, this is a student that I taught and was in our school probably 20 years ago, and he saw that I was in this particular city and had messaged me to see if we could have lunch together. We had lunch. The student had cerebral palsy. And when I thought back to his experience in our school, we had put into place all kinds of supports for the student. We'd met with his mom, single mom, had helped in many ways. And I would see his experience as being a successful experience. It was interesting having lunch with him. He didn't talk about any of those memories of his time at school. What he talked about was a leadership conference that the teachers and I had recommended that he go to. And I was struck by that, and it was just a reminder that leadership conference and what led to his nomination for that was because of the relationships that teachers had developed with this particular student, with the special education teacher had developed, that I had developed, that EAs had developed with them. As a result of those relationships, the we all saw that this particular student had incredible leadership potential, and as a result led to this nomination for the leadership conference. He couldn't stop speaking about the fact that these teachers and the staff of the school nominated him for the leadership conference. Not all the resources and the supports that we provided for him. The basis for that nomination was relationships. And it's just such a great reminder that when we work with students with special education needs, we can have all the resources. We need those resources. We need support people. We need assistive technology. We need the kinds of things that are going to help them be successful. But those things have to be paired with relationships, and students thrive when relationships are part of their experience. I think of my own experience. In grade 6, my family had recently moved to Canada. English was not my first language, believe it or not. I had a grade 6 teacher who, and I won't mention his name, he's recently retired, who about the second week of school saw that I was really struggling and invited me to come to a running club. And I thought this was a strange thing, this idea of a running club. But every morning at 7:30 in the morning, he would invite a bunch of grade 6 students and we would go running together. And we ran together for the entirety of that year. He took us into 10-kilometer races and 5-kilometer races across southern Ontario. I had the privilege of actually teaching in a classroom in a different school, but in a classroom beside him early in my teaching career. And I mentioned to him how important that aspect of relationships was to my own journey. And again, when we think about intersectionality, with learning a language, with learning what it means to be in a school in southern Ontario, that relational aspect was key to my successes in school and eventually becoming a teacher and a school administrator. So relationships are key because they do two things for us. One is they help us understand the whole person. When we don't know other people, we only see an aspect of them. So forming relationships with students, professional relationships, helps us get to know the whole person. And the second thing that relationships do is they help us from this idea of othering other people. So othering other people means that we see them by a particular attribute or a particular characteristic, a particular aspect of their background, and we develop a perspective of them based on that. And that might be a stereotype, it might be stigmatized, but that leads to this idea of there's something a little bit different or maybe significantly different than myself. Relationships helps break down the othering that happens with other students. And I go back to the idea that diversity is a strength. And as opposed to thinking of others as by their deficits or their weaknesses or what we perceive as differences, but to recognize the strengths that they bring and how that diversity enriches our school environment. So relationships helps us see the whole person, and it helps prevent us from othering the people, the students, the staff members, the family members who might be part of our school community. One of the interesting aspects of some of the research we've been doing across Canada has been listening to stories and anecdotes from principals about how they've seen relationships used to foster inclusive school environments. And I was really struck by one particular story that a principal shared from their experience with supporting a student with special education needs. And it was interesting because it really wasn't their story. It wasn't the story of a teacher. It was actually the story of a custodian in a school, and how that custodian and the relationship that custodian had with a student with really significant oppositional behavioral needs that led to the success of that student in the school. And it was a significant reminder for me that as principals, we're fostering a school environment that is holistic in the sense that it's not just about students, family members, teachers, and ourselves as school principals. It's everyone in that school, including the person who works in the office, including the lunch monitors, including the educational assistants, including the custodial staff. It might include bus drivers for that matter. So seeing everyone in the school as part of that school community and using the relationships that everyone develops with students as a way to leverage success for students with special education needs. In this particular example, the custodian had developed a relationship with a student where everyone else seemed to develop barriers because of the behaviors that the student had developed. And what this principal shared was they were able to use that relationship with the custodian. The principal then became involved with that relationship just very casually, and a teacher as well. And they used that to start building trust with the student, for that student to recognize that they could trust the custodian, which they already did, they could trust the teacher, which they started to do, and they could trust the principal. But the custodian was the gatekeeper to to that relationship. And it was a powerful example, and I think it's a great reminder for us as principals to recognize that relationships are key, but it's not just relationships between the teachers, it's not just relationships with the special education resource teacher, it's not just relationships with the principal, it's thinking about all the relational aspects within the school, and then using those relationships to model for our other students. What does it mean to live in community together? What does it mean to be in this place together as colleagues and as friends and as teachers and students, not to see each other as, again, othering other people and seeing them as based on their differences, but recognizing them as full members in the school community. So relationships and intersectionality go hand in hand. In fact, we could say that you can't have one without the other. Intersectionality is about recognizing differences, and those differences, the different aspects that create who we are as our identities, can be disadvantaged or can be perceived as disadvantaged by others. So relationships helps break down some of those disadvantages. It helps us to see the full person. It helps us to see that, again, we share this common humanity that can really provide a holistic perspective of what it means to be a school community that welcomes all people to it. So there are different ways that are aspects of intersectionality, whether those are sexual orientation or socioeconomics or language or ethnicity, can be seen as disadvantaged or disadvantageous to a student. So school principals have a tremendous opportunity to model the way for teachers and for families and for students in their school by demonstrating ways that diversity can be celebrated. One of the ways we can start by doing this is by using our office space as a place that students see as a welcoming place, a place where their needs as well as their strengths and their aspects of intersectionality are celebrated. But it can ripple out from the office, and it needs to ripple out from the office. It becomes something that can be celebrated in the hallways of the school, in the classrooms of the school, for elementary schools, in the playgrounds of the school, in high schools, in the cafeterias of the school. How do we celebrate the differences? So seeing them as aspects of strength as opposed to weaknesses or deficits. So seeing those areas of difference as being really incredibly important to the fabric of the school. Sometimes I hear principals say, that's fantastic, but how do we make that happen? And I often will say it's not necessarily through big programs and new initiatives. Those can be important, but it's through relationships, and it's through often very small steps, and maybe steps that might be even non-perceived or imperceived by those in the school. So I think of an expression. I do a lot of work in Haiti, and one of the beautiful Haitian Creole proverbs that I've just held on to, which I think speaks volumes about how we create these kinds of spaces. It goes like this. It's piti piti te pai pai, oiseau finish. And what that expression says in English is, little by little, straw by straw, a bird builds its nest. I think it's a lovely expression. Sometimes it's little by little, straw by straw, piti piti te pai pai, that nest, that community of the school is built in ways that's welcoming of all students, recognizes diversity as a strength, builds equitable structures within the school, is aware of those aspects of disadvantage, and works actively to provide new ways that incorporates and welcomes and includes all students into that school community. So intersectionality, it's really important with an intersectional approach to realize that intersectionality is not just about awareness of the various aspects of identity, but it's also striving to create the conditions or to change the conditions that might lead to biases and stereotypes and generalizations. So it's an act of, Carolyn Shields, who does a lot of work in transformative leadership, talks about the importance of school leaders being actively engaged in changing those systems and structures that might prevent equitable outcomes for all students. It's about creating a space that incorporates and welcomes teachers to be part of that process as well. So when I think about the Ontario Leadership Framework, this idea of transformative leadership isn't just about the leader doing these things by themselves, but it's about engaging everyone within the school. It's about setting direction for folks, but not doing that just as an autocratic type of a thing, but bringing that direction together with other people. It's about building people, and it's about building relationships. It's about striving together to foster that kind of that safe space, those inclusive environments that welcome all students and their family members to the school.